Everyone's asleep except you. Your mind replays every mistake, every embarrassing moment. You can't make it stop. What if a single habit, practiced in the midnight, could turn a man from total ruin to unshakable peace, wealth, and respect? Ezekiel was a mill owner losing everything: his sleep, his business, his family. He replayed every failure until dawn, trapped in a nightmare of his own making. Then he met a wandering merchant who had once lost it all, a man named Zerah, who handed him a strange habit, a closing ritual before sleep. What happened next stunned the village, the king's own steward, and everyone who had written Ezekiel off. This is the story of the midnight habit that rewired a man's entire destiny without changing his circumstances overnight, but by changing the one thing that mattered most. What is the one failure you replay over and over when you try to sleep? Drop a single word that describes how you feel right now. In the old kingdom of Thornwall, where stone houses huddled beneath a tired castle, a mill owner named Ezekiel lay on his straw mattress, eyes wide open. The hour was deep midnight. The village slept, but inside Ezekiel's head, a storm raged, a replay of everything that had gone wrong. 3 seasons of thin harvest, a deal with a grain merchant that collapsed and left him drowning in debt, the angry words he had flung at his wife Mara that very evening, the way his young son Caleb had looked at him with disappointed eyes, the creak of the mill's worn grinding stone which he could not afford to replace. Every mistake, every harsh word, every lost coin looped endlessly behind his eyelids. He had not slept peacefully in months. His face grew pale, his work suffered. Customers began to go to the mill in the next village. The debt collector's visits became more frequent. Ezekiel felt himself shrinking into a hollow, hopeless shell.
One market day, too exhausted to manage his stall, Ezekiel sat slumped behind sacks of flour. A stranger approached, a tall man with silver-streaked hair, carrying a merchant's pack embroidered with symbols from distant lands. He introduced himself as Zerah, a traveling trader of spices, cloth, and odd wisdom. Zerah smiled warmly and pointed at Ezekiel's flour. "Good grain," he said, "but the miller looks like he carries a boulder on his back." Ezekiel hardly responded. Zerah bought a sack and lingered. Something about the old trader's calmness radiated like steady candlelight. Eventually, Ezekiel muttered, "My sleep has abandoned me. Every night I see my failures. I cannot rest." Zerah sat beside him. "Once I was the wealthiest merchant in the southern passes," he said quietly, "until a fire took my wagons, my goods, my home. I lost everything. For 2 years I walked like a ghost. Sleep was my enemy. But then I learned a closing ritual. It saved my life. Then it rebuilt my fortune." Ezekiel scoffed. "A ritual? I need coin, not magic." "Not magic, a habit," Zerah replied. "You are a miller. Every evening you close the mill door, lock it, and put away the keys. You know the day's work is done. But your mind never closes. It leaves every ledger open, every regret unshut, so your soul cannot rest. I will teach you the midnight closing. Do it before sleep and watch what happens." Ezekiel was desperate. That night he followed Zerah's instructions. On a small wooden table he lit a candle stub. He took a scrap of bark and a piece of charcoal. Sitting in the dim light, he wrote down 3 things that gnawed at him: the failed merchant deal, the harsh tone with Mara, the grinding stone's crack. Zara had said, "You do not hide them, you name them. Then you read them aloud and you tell yourself, I see you, I learn from you, I do not need to carry you into tomorrow." Ezekiel felt foolish, but he whispered the words. Then Zara's voice echoed in his memory. "Now burn the bark, watch the smoke rise. As it fades, speak this, I close this day. What is done is done. The work of tomorrow is its own. Then blow out the candle." He burned the scrap. Smoke curled upward. He blew out the candle. For the first time in many months, sleep came before the weight of his thoughts could crush him. It was not a full night's rest, but a sliver of relief, a tiny win. The next morning, Ezekiel's head felt fractionally clearer. He noticed that the mill's leather belt was slipping, a small problem he had ignored for weeks. He tightened it, and the grinding improved slightly. A neighbor, old Hannah, brought a small bag of corn to grind. She paid in eggs. It was not much, but it was a start. Hope, fragile as a sprout, began to stir. The habit was not a cure-all. Days later, a new problem hammered him. The debt collector, a stone-faced man named Garrick, arrived with a final demand. Pay the full sum within a moon, or the mill would be seized. Panic flooded Ezekiel. That night, his old pattern returned. He lay rigid, replaying every humiliation. But then he remembered the ritual. He forced himself to rise, lit the candle, and wrote, "Fear of losing the mill, shame before my family, helpless anger at Garrick." He read them, burned the bark, and spoke the closing words. He told himself, "I cannot solve it tonight. Tomorrow is a new day." He slept. In the morning, a strange thought came. What if Garrick could become a partner instead of an enemy? The idea seemed absurd, but because Ezekiel's mind was not drowning in panic, he dared to try. He walked to Garrick's office and made a humble proposal: a share of the mill's future profits in exchange for canceling the immediate debt. To his shock, Garrick, weary of chasing bad debts, agreed with a stern contract. The mill was saved. Ezekiel's business began to breathe again. The closing ritual had turned a crisis into a doorway. Confidence, which had been buried under layers of failure, now crept back. In the village council, the subject of mill taxes arose. In the past, Ezekiel would have stayed silent, terrified of speaking up. The night before the meeting, he used his ritual to close the memory of a boyhood humiliation when a crowd laughed at his stutter. He burned that old shame. Standing before the council, his voice did not waver. He suggested a fair tax based on harvest yield. The elders listened. For the first time, they saw a leader, not a broken man. The change rippled outward. His workers noticed a steadier hand, and his authority grew. The habit also began to mend the deepest wound, his relationship with his son, Caleb. The boy had avoided his father, afraid of sudden outbursts. One evening, after a frustrating day, Ezekiel had snapped at Caleb over a broken water jug. That night, guilt gnawed. He went to his candle and bark. He wrote, "I wounded my son's heart today. I let my anger speak before love." He burned the note and said the closing words. The next morning, he knelt before Caleb, looked him in the eye, and said, "I was wrong. A father should close his anger before sleep, not carry it into a new day. Will you forgive me?" Caleb's eyes welled, and he hugged his father tightly. Their relationship began to heal. Mara, watching from the doorway, felt the cold wall between them begin to thaw. Prosperity did not come instantly, but the mill grew. Ezekiel, no longer weighed down by the past, started experimenting with new flour blends. He partnered with a farmer to grow hardy rye. The village began to speak of Thornwall flour in nearby markets. The habit kept his sleep clear, and clear sleep fed a sharp mind. Even when a sudden spring flood tore through the river and soaked half his grain stores, Ezekiel did not collapse. That night, he named the loss, burned the note, and closed the day. The next morning, he rallied the village to salvage what they could. The people, now trusting his steady leadership, worked alongside him. The disaster became a story of community strength, not ruin. One day, the king's steward rode into the village with a heavy demand: supply flour for the castle's winter stores at a fixed, punishingly low price. Refusal meant losing the royal license entirely. The other millers panicked, but Ezekiel used his closing ritual the night before he negotiated. He wrote, "Fear of royal power, the memory of my past weakness, the voice that says I am not enough." He let them all go in the candle's smoke. When he faced the steward, he calmly proposed a contract that included a fair price in exchange for larger future volumes and a promise of on-time delivery. He spoke with quiet authority, not desperate pleading. The steward, impressed, agreed. Ezekiel's mill became the royal supplier. The same man who could not sleep now stood in the castle granary, respected by the highest in the land. Years passed. Thornwall's mill prospered. Ezekiel trained his son Caleb in the craft and in the midnight habit. He taught his workers a simple version. Before leaving the mill each evening, they would stand at the door and say, "I leave my mistakes here. Tomorrow, I start fresh." The culture shifted. The mill thrived not only in grain, but in human dignity. One autumn, an old man with a merchant's pack appeared at the mill door. It was Zerah, his hair now fully white, his steps slower. Ezekiel embraced him. He told Zerah everything: the debt turned to partnership, the speech before the council, the healed heart with Caleb, the royal contract, the flood. Zerah listened with deep contentment. They sat by the hearth that night. Zerah said, "You have done what I hoped. You turned a simple closing into a way of life. But know this, you did not just close your days, you opened a new legacy." He pulled from his pack a small, ancient wooden box. Inside was a charred piece of bark. "This was my first note from the night after the fire. I have carried it to remember. Now I give it to you, so you may pass on the habit to someone who still lies awake in torment." Ezekiel accepted the gift with trembling hands. The next morning, Zerah departed with the sunrise, never to be seen again. But his wisdom remained etched into the mill's walls. The final lesson was clear. Every night we have a choice. We can take the failures, the wounds, the disappointments, and lock them in a mental room, or we can leave the doors open
so they wander into our sleep and poison our tomorrows. Ezekiel learned that closing the day is not about forgetting, it is about releasing the weight so that the new dawn can find you ready, not exhausted.
Now, you need to reflect. What bark are you clutching as you try to rest? What words, what regrets, what harsh sentences do you replay on the pillow? The midnight habit does not ask for wealth, strength, or perfect circumstances. It asks only a candle, a piece of paper, and the courage to name and release. But hear this clearly. The candle and the bark were never the real magic. They were simply the tools of a man in a village with no other way. The magic is in the closing. If you have no candle tonight, take your phone. Open a blank note. Type the heaviness, every regret, every harsh word. Read it once, slowly, like you are acknowledging an old enemy. Then press delete. Watch the screen go empty. Let that emptiness be your smoke. If you keep a simple notebook by your bed, write it down by hand. Feel the pen press into the paper. Then close the cover firmly. Place your palm on it and whisper, "This day is closed. I do not carry it into tomorrow." If you have nothing but your own breath, lie still in the dark. Name each weight silently, one by one. With every exhale, picture it drifting out of you like thin smoke vanishing into a vast, quiet sky. When the last one fades, take one deep breath and say inside your heart, "I am free of this day."